to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Gareth Tennant.
And me, Chris Kitchener.
In this podcast, we explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business, comparing and contrasting our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick. And this week, you're joining us for episode 2 of our influencers deep dive into the great Winston Churchill.
See, you said the great Winston Churchill. You didn't say that during the first episode, but you've thought about the stuff he's done already and you've called him great. Did you see that?
I did. Well, you did the intro for the last episode, so let's blame it on that.
We were pontificating. We should never do this. We pontificate off recording sometimes. And Gareth wisely says, stop talking, Chris. We're supposed to do this when we're recording. One of the things that struck me through, you do the preparation, you do the research, then you talk about it. Weirdly, once you say the words out loud, you get these other sort of thoughts to go through. One of the things about I am a fan of Winston Churchill, and no doubt there'll be some people that tell me he did some terrible things, and I wouldn't necessarily argue with those. But one of the things I think about him is his persistence.
Yeah.
This is a man who does a thing, and whether he succeeds or not, then he does another thing, and then he does another thing, and then he does another thing. So I think in this episode, we're going to actually talk more about his failures. And let's be clear, they were some pretty big failures and some pretty bad failures. But I think what we're going to see is this quality of persistence to say that might have been wrong, but now this is what we're going to go and do. And I think that's interesting. So when we left you, dear listeners, last time, Herbert Asquith had just appointed Churchill First Lord of the Admiralty, which oddly does seem to be an odd choice, given that it wasn't that much earlier, a year and a half earlier, he had campaigned for the Royal Navy to not be expanded because, quote, he didn't think that war with Germany was inevitable. Well, he's now First Lord of the Admiralty, and the first thing he does is create a naval war staff. And for the next couple of years, he focuses on preparing the Navy for war. He visits naval stations, dockyards, he improves morale, he scrutinizes German naval developments. This is a man who is highly focused on, I am going to build the Royal Navy to a point where it can fight successfully a war. Don't get me wrong, it was still a very powerful naval force. In fact, arguably the most powerful naval force in the world, but he was clearly not resting on his laurels. And in 1912, Germany passed a law to increase warship production. And Churchill vowed, and by the way, you should be proud, we haven't done a Churchill voice up until now. And I suspect we should probably stick to that and not try and do a Churchill voice. But he vowed that for every new German battleship, Britain would build 2. Of course, I'm a great fan of the Royal Navy, as we've discussed in the past. Gareth, obviously vaguely related to the Navy. So, sure.
Vaguely related to the Navy? Is that how you're describing it?
He's tilting his head. He's tilting his head, everyone. I'm doing that with tongue-in-cheek, by the way.
I am proudly a former member of the Naval Service.
Oh, get in there. We love that. That's what we like to hear, ladies and gentlemen. We need to get more Army and RAF people on so we can be slightly rude to them and then laugh and say it's banter. Anyway, so Royal Navy, on my side of the fence, he brought renewed focus on the Royal Naval Air Service. And I read this and I thought, no, this can't be true. This is the kind of thing that people write afterwards when they say, Kim Il-jong, I heard this week, Kim Il-jong, one of the Kim Ils, apparently shot a round of golf where he had 16 holes in one or something ridiculous. Yeah. It's nonsense he didn't do it. In fact, in that case, I think it's because they do golf scoring differently and the South Koreans wanted to make him sound like a crazy man, but that's a different conversation. But he encouraged the Royal Naval Air Service to experiment how aircraft can be used for military purposes. And I'm still not convinced of this. He coined the term seaplane and ordered 100 to be constructed. by the way, I read that and thought, really? Did he coin the term seaplane? Yeah, he didn't. A French aviation pioneer called Henri Fabre, who designed and powered a flying seaplane, designed a powered plane on the water. He called it that. In fact, it was called the Fabre Hydravion. 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 My French isn't that great.
Sounds
But
good.
anyway, he saw the value of this and ordered 100, or ordered them constructed. Secondly, the power of his narrative that this gentleman, Mr. Fabre, is probably really pissed off that something he invented has apparently been given to a fat bloke with a cigar with an English accent, but there you go.
Yeah.
But here's the lesson. What we're starting to see is this is not a one-dimensional tactical leader. This is now a strategic leader who understands how to move the big pieces in the right ways to strategically prepare for war, whether it be shipbuilding, whether it be creating tactics and new technologies. We're going to see this again and again where he is on the front line of talking about tactics in a strategic way, if that makes sense. As in,
It does,
said, this is what we are going to be doing. I am going to fund this and make it happen.
I think if you can talk about being strategic in your discussion of tactics, you have understood the difference and the definitions of tactics and strategy. So I commend you there, Chris. I feel like you've learned something in the 2 years we've been doing this podcast.
You can't see this, but I'm looking very, very pleased with myself for Gareth to say you have learned something, Padawan, and that but it's true. And actually, we joke. By looking at these people doing these things, you start to see patterns that you might not otherwise have seen.
Yeah.
He wasn't just a bloke who had a great idea down the pub. This was well thought out and complicated. In 1913, he said we're building 4 new battleships in 1914 and 1915. And he said, if you don't let me do that, I will resign. How interesting is that? Now, the I threaten to resign only gets you so far, but you can see him moving the Royal Navy forward. You can see this is the man that is driving the development of the Royal Navy. How interesting, given that he was a soldier as well, that he doesn't have that. He wasn't born to an admiral or something like that. He didn't grow up as a midshipman. That's really interesting. So he people say, cometh the time, cometh the man. 1939, Churchill became a war leader. He was a war leader in 1913. In fact, at this point, he's quite a seasoned war leader. And by the way, he hasn't even hit 40 yet, I don't think, if we look at the timing.
Which is incredible, isn't it?
Isn't that incredible? And so when the First World War kicks off, does the First World War kick off? When it starts, I don't think it's a football match. He was, of course, tasked with overseeing Britain's naval effort. People don't think about this. People think World War I wasn't really a naval war. Obviously, there are some huge naval battles that are fought that people talk about, but the Royal Navy transported 120,000 troops to France at the beginning of the war and began the blockade of Germany's North Sea port. So this is an important part of power projection in that time, and obviously it hasn't changed. He sent submarines to the Baltic Sea to assist with the Russian Navy and sent the Marine Brigade to Ostend, forcing a reallocation of German troops. And, okay, here we go. We'll play the game again. So, head of the Admiralty, runs the Royal Navy. What is he now going to do next? In fact, rather, what responsibility is he given next?
Oh, I think I know this. Is this where he becomes Minister of Armament?
Not yet. Not yet. He is given responsibility for Britain's aerial defence.
Of course. Right. Yes.
Yes. Winston, we've been thinking about this. Those Hun are going to send their Zeppelins and planes over. You should stop that. And so that's what he was charged with doing. Okay. The next thing,
while still being
The Admiralty. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, of
Wow.
course. This next one is allegedly, and again, it is stated as fact, but this is one I can't. This feels like if he is, he really is the hero. What was the next thing he was the effective father of?
Oh, at this point, it could be anything, couldn't it? Like, what
Go on.
hasn't they invented? I
First
mean,
World War.
the
First
tank,
World War is the right answer, Gareth.
of course.
Of
Yeah.
course it is. He allegedly set the development of the tank on the right track and financed its creation. This is true. The first tank was developed with Admiralty funds
Yeah.
because that's what the Royal Navy funds. It was funded, this is great, through the Admiralty's Land Ships Committee. And can I just say, hooray for the Royal Navy. We should build tanks. How are we going to get that past them? Call them land ships. So there you go. So we're now, okay, he's driving the Royal Navy, invented the seaplane, which he didn't invent, invented the tank, which he didn't invent, but actually he's funding. He's in charge of aerial defense. Where does this man's talents end? Well, in about March 1915, we're going to find that out. So he is now strategic and clearly influential. And he says, you know what we should do? We should relieve pressure on the Russians in the Caucasus. And the way to do that is to attack Turkey, who is aligned to Germany. And we're going to do this in a place called the
Dardanelles.
Dardanelles. Gallipoli looks like a good place. We should go there. 1915, an Anglo-French task force attempts to bombard the Turkish defences. And then in April, the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force, including the Australians and the Anzacs, the New Zealand Army Corps, begin their assault on Gallipoli. And as history tells us, both campaigns fail miserably, and Churchill is personally held responsible by many MPs, particularly Conservatives. And in May, Prime Minister Asquith agrees under parliamentary pressure to form an all-party coalition government, but the Conservatives' condition of entry was that Churchill is removed from the Admiralty. This is a man who is on the up, Gallipoli, and a political sort of how people come together in times of war is predicated on get rid of that guy.
Yeah.
Churchill pleads his case, accepts the demotion. Interestingly, was it his fault? Was Gallipoli his fault? And by the way, I'm sure there are historians that could spend equally 2 episodes on this. Notionally, from what I've read, it was a combination of poor planning, poor execution, stiff Ottoman resistance, which people hadn't quite expected. Probably unfair to place the full blame on Churchill, but it was his decision, and his reputation suffered as a result. So he resigns from government, remains an MP, and then says to Asquith, I would like to become the Governor General of British East Africa. And Asquith says, bugger off. Or something probably a bit more Asquithy than bugger off. So what does he do, Gareth? It is November 1915. He's resigned from the government. He's still an MP. What does the ex-First Lord of the Admiralty do, Gareth?
I reckon he goes to the front line to command an infantry battalion.
He does exactly. I mean, frankly, that is the answer to most questions we ask about Churchill, is he joins the army and goes to fight. January 1916, he's promoted to lieutenant colonel and given command of the 6th Royal Scots Fusiliers. The battalion is moved to the Belgian front near a place called Plugstert, which is difficult to pronounce and so is known as Plug Street by the British soldiers. It's shelled for 3 months, but there's no German offensive. It's a slightly quieter part of the line. His cousin visits, and they are shelled, and he narrowly escapes death when a large piece of shrapnel falls between them. At that point, I don't know, that I suspect there's a story here to be uncovered. His unit was merged with another, and at that point he went back to the UK and he left active service. His temporary promotion to lieutenant colonel ended on the 16th of May. At that point he returned back to the rank of major. But again, let's just take a step back. This was the first Lord of the Admiralty. He had been Home Secretary. He gets demoted, and exactly as you say, he says, and I have to believe it's a he says, I'm going to go to the front lines on the Western Front and I'm going to command a military unit. Imagine if you heard that today. No one would believe that. In fact, what I loved about that story was I'd never heard that he had effectively fought on the front lines in the trenches on the Western Front. I think that tells you a lot about the man and how much he's done. That's the one bit people say, I'll scratch that off, let's not talk about that. But there's bravery, there is dedication, there is loyalty, there is love of country. I think that tells you a lot about him. I also think it's particularly bonkers.
It is bonkers, and I think it's fascinating that he was allowed to go to be just a lieutenant colonel in command of a battalion, because, as you say, he'd been foreign secretary, he was the Lord of the Admiralty, he was the chap responsible for defence of the air, and by this point is also a very famous person, presumably almost a household name. To risk getting captured or killed, I'm surprised that they actually let him do it.
I get the feeling he probably didn't let
Okay.
them or tell them or care. He just said,
Yeah,
I'm going to go and bloody do it. And they're like, well, all right, as long as you're
yeah,
not getting in our way. Anyway, he comes back, and you were exactly right. You just got it 3 jobs before. In 1970, he becomes the Minister for Munitions because, of course, he's still an MP when he's not fighting or conducting war, and he ends 2 strikes. So he does an important job. At that
yeah.
point, there is significant civil strife, and he negotiates the end of those strikes. He also is responsible for demobilizing the army, but he's not a crazy man. He convinces Lloyd George to keep 1 million men conscripted for the British Army on the Rhine. He understands that after the war, you're going to need lots of soldiers to keep the peace. Very interesting. And he was also, again, the reason it's interesting, the first time you say, well, maybe this was taken out of context, cherry picked, you can start to see a constant drumbeat of how he thinks about these things. He cautioned against harsh measures against Germany. Wise man, that's a bad idea. Interestingly, he also cautioned against the demobilization of the German army, quote, warning that they might be needed as a bulwark against Soviet Russia. He was not a fan of Vladimir Lenin's Communist Party, and so he knew from an early stage that the Soviets and the communists were people he should watch out for. At that point, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's fascinating that this is a guy who clearly is not afraid of a fight. The antithesis of a coward. Almost to the point of possibly or probably at times recklessness. So he's not squeamish.
Nope.
He has already proven on several occasions that he will make difficult decisions or make public his opinions on contentious issues based on what he thinks is right and having the courage of his convictions, and is also able to have the foresight and the humility and the magnanimity, it's a difficult word to say, to not come back from the Dardanelles fiasco, 3 months getting shelled in Belgium, defence of the British Isles from air attack for the first time, where we've had aircraft and Zeppelins dropping bombs on civilians, and being the Minister of Armaments building up and building the industrial base to fight the largest industrial war in the history of, well, in history, and yet has the magnanimity to say, and the foresight to say, if we impose punitive sanctions, if we don't have 1 million men on the Rhine, this will happen again.
As I was reading this out, I was thinking, I bet Mr. Machiavelli would quite like Winston Churchill.
Absolutely. This is a guy who is a strategist, is a pragmatist,
and he has virtue.
He has virtue. He has courage. He has curiosity, and he's got a little bit of pip. Get up and go.
It's great. I'm watching this. You really like him, don't you? You really like
I do. I'm trying not to. Oh, no, that's not fair. I'm not trying not to like him.
No, but you're trying to be objective and
I'm trying to be objective, but
this is never meant to be an exercise in saying, "Oh, aren't they wonderful? We love them." Because actually, I think both you and I feel when you lose that objectivity, you fall into the traps of,
yes.
well, if I wear jumpers like him, I will be like him, or if I smoke a cigar, then everyone will think I'm like, no, but I I think he would have been a fascinating person to talk to. I don't think you'd have been very interested in talking to us because you'd be like, that's all nonsense, but he'd be fascinating. Yeah. So he's just finished the First World War. He's a fighter. He is persistent. So what does he do now? Yeah, he spends his time painting and writing his memoirs. Of course he does. Of course he does. And actually, I believe he's quite a good painter. And in terms of a writer, he loves his writing. Never did any more romantic novels, by the way. I think it was his one and only.
One and only, right.
There you go. Again, moves to the Conservative Party in 1924. There you go. He's changing. Made Chancellor of the Exchequer. Is there a job this man has not done, including tank designer, Chancellor of the Exchequer? And then they talk about the wilderness years where, frankly, he was sort of in political backwaters in the 20s and 30s. He also started to sort of talk about his depression, which was known as the Black Dog. And he talked about how writing helped him through this depression. Interestingly, today, I wonder whether we'd talk about it being PTSD.
Potentially.
I wonder.
Yeah.
He began work on a book, Marlborough, His Life and Times, a biography of John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough. And he was developing a reputation for being a heavy drinker, although it's said that biographers think that to some degree that was exaggerated. This is great just before we get to the Second World War, and maybe we'll stop before we get to the Second World War. But in Munich, he met Ernst yeah, I speak German and I don't even know how to say it.
German, Chris. Come on.
Yeah, no, I know. Hang on. Hanfstangl. That's the closest I'm going to get. Anyway, Ernst was a friend of Hitler who was rising in prominence in 1932. And Ernst tried to arrange a meeting between Churchill and Hitler, but Hitler was unenthusiastic, saying, quote, "What on earth would I talk to him about?" Oh, there you go. Coincidence in the world. After Hitler came to power in 1933, Churchill was very unsurprisingly quick to stand in opposition to Hitler and his regime. And guess what? He is saying loudly that he was concerned that we had reduced our spending on the Air Force and was warning that Germany would soon overtake Britain in their production of aircraft. Again, this is a strategic person. He sees what's going on. He warns the government against appeasement. So there's sort of in 1937, the Prime Minister resigns and Neville Chamberlain takes over. Churchill's pleased about the appointment, but then Chamberlain starts to appease Mussolini. So he's starting to say, you should not appease Hitler. This is not good.
Yeah.
And he said, and I quote, a country like ours, possessed of immense territory and wealth, whose defence has been neglected, cannot avoid war by dilating upon its horrors or by ignoring the fate of victims of aggression elsewhere. War will be avoided in present circumstances only by the accumulation of deterrence against the aggressor. And I read that and thought, he could have said that today. There are many people saying, well, we should give Putin what he wants because then he'll just be happy with Ukraine. This is, I think, a lesson in history. And Churchill would have been standing here today saying, you let Putin take land in Ukraine and you might as well give him the keys to Europe and beyond. So I thought that was fascinating. And that takes us up to the beginning of the Second World War, which is probably a good time for a break. What do you think?
I think I need a break.
Do you need a break? It's great, isn't it? It's just this breakneck
So
score.
much.
We're
Yeah.
like, what's he going to do next? And purposely, by the way, I spent a load of time. Have you noticed we've spent 3/4 of these 2 episodes before we get to World War II? Because
Yeah.
actually, if you think about his narrative, today it's World War II. Actually, we kind of know what happens in that. We'll go through it. But all these things that have led up to it says that's why he was a great war leader. It wasn't accident. It was because of all the things that had happened. Okay,
Yeah.
let's come straight back after the break and let's talk a little bit World War II. See you in a second. Welcome back. 3rd of September 1939, the day that Britain declares war on Germany, Chamberlain reappoints Churchill as the First Lord of the Admiralty. Luckily, he knows a bit about this. So again, the second time he's the First Lord of the Admiralty. Not bad. And he joins Chamberlain's war cabinet. At that point, when France is invaded, all of a sudden, confidence in Chamberlain wavers, and there are only 2 candidates, Churchill and Halifax, the Foreign Secretary. Halifax admits he can't govern effectively as a member of the House of Lords, so Chamberlain advises the king to send for Churchill, who is now the Prime Minister. Churchill later wrote of a profound sense of relief as he now had authority over the whole scene. He believed his life so far had been, quote, a preparation for this hour and for this trial. And given what we've learned over the last hour and a half, you can you can understand why he thinks that way.
Yeah.
It's interesting now. So British expeditionary forces in retreat. Dunkirk, fall of France imminent. Halifax weakens and proposes the government should explore a peace settlement using who was at this point neutral, Mussolini, as an intermediary. Churchill says, we will fight on. Interestingly, Churchill had a speech impediment and he had a lisp, and yet he still manages to be known for his oratory and his speeches. 13th of May, 1940, it's his blood, toil, tears and sweat speech. Quote, I would say to the House that I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears and sweat. We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. You ask, what is our policy? I will say, it is to wage war by sea, land and air with all our might and with all the strength that God can give us. To wage war against a monstrous tyranny never surpassed in the dark, lamentable catalogue of human crime. That is our policy. You ask what is our aim? I can answer in one word. It is victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. victory, however long and hard the road. For without victory, there is no survival. End quote. And as I copied and pasted that, I got that obviously online. Do you know what struck me? Vision, mission, goal. If ever you were to clearly communicate in a couple of sentences where this really mattered, this was to the Commons, and of course it was repeated on the radio, that is quite amazing. Followed up very quickly after the Dunkirk evacuation. And I know you've heard these before, but I think these are amazing speeches. Again, I don't know whether he wrote them, but they are amazing in terms of what they meant. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France, and we shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. And even if, which I do not for a moment believe, brackets, don't know he necessarily believes that, this island or a large part of it was subjugated and starving, then our empire beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British fleet, would carry on the struggle until in God's good time, the new world with all its power and might steps forth to the rescue and liberation of the old. Really, really, really strategically interesting. You know, everyone remembers we shall fight them on the beaches. He is saying, if we are defeated, don't worry, because our empire and the new world, America, with all its power, will come to our rescue. He is thinking 3 steps ahead. He already recognizes the critical part the United States will play, and he is already thinking about what that means and communicating to it. Last quote. This was after the fall of France. I'm desperate to do the voice, but I'm not going to.
Go on, do it.
No. No, I'm not. I was nearly going to do it. You gave me permission. I'm not going to do it. What General Weygand called the Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty and so bear ourselves that if the British Commonwealth and Empire lasts for 1,000 years, men will say, this was their finest hour. By the way, have you noticed when we repeat that this was their finest hour, we never mention Commonwealth and Empire? Anyway, different thing. Hugely, hugely important part of his leadership. Imagine the man standing in front of you when you think we should cut and run. We should make a deal. We should, give up. Look at the French. This was the biggest army in the world and they were defeated. The Germans are coming for us and they're on a roll. This is the man who says, the equivalent of today, I need bullets, not a ride. Yeah. That's really, really powerful. So here you go with the next one. So everyone's heard those speeches, and that was just a bit of indulgence for me to talk about that. Here is a lesser known fact, and I don't know how many people listening to this know that. At the suggestion of Charles de Gaulle, we've talked about de Gaulle on another influencers. Go listen to that one. That's another fantastic story, including escapes, threatening America with nuclear attack. But de Gaulle says, some dramatic move was essential to give Renault the support to keep his government in the war. In other words, this was how do we keep the French government in the war without capitulating? Churchill accepted and supported a proposal to create a union between France and the United Kingdom. In other words, he was proposing that France and the UK come together as a single country. Again, not many people talk about that. The final declaration of union, which was approved by the British War Cabinet, stated, France and Great Britain shall no longer be 2 nations, but one Franco-British union. The Constitution of the Union will provide for joint organs of defence, foreign, financial and economic policies. Every citizen of France will enjoy immediately citizenship of Great Britain, and every British subject will become a citizen of France. Imagine how much better our cheese would be today if that had happened.
It's a fascinating kind of. It's a punctuation mark in history, and it's a punctuation mark in the legacy of Churchill. But imagine if that had happened, how different our relationship with Europe would be today. Incredible.
In Europe and part of Europe.
Well, yes. I wasn't going to necessarily dwell on that, but yes, quite.
No, but I mean, the reason why that, I mean, first of all, that's I think a lesser known part of history, which for political reasons, both the French and the British don't want to dwell upon. But what a bold statement.
Yeah.
What an incredible thing to support and be willing to go through with after hundreds of years thousands of years as a nation. Well, hundreds of years, actually, technically, to say we are willing to, in inverted commas, give up our sovereignty to support another country. Amazing. Unsurprisingly, the French leaders went, or whatever the French version of a raspberry is, and they called it, I love this, it was a plan by the British to steal their colonies, and that being a Nazi province was preferable to becoming a British dominion. Well, tell us
Strong
how
words.
that. Yeah. Unsurprising, given that this was the same country that later de Gaulle said, what was it, when the Americans were attacking North Africa, and de Gaulle said, I hope we throw them back into the sea. They're on your side. Anyway, no, but that to one side, that is absolutely amazing. And by the way, not going through with that, in other words, not becoming a single country, was what allowed Pétain to take over from Renault and effectively create Vichy France. So there were, knock-on effects. This was effectively one of the steps that created the history that we know. Fascinating. I mean, I think this guy knows how to be a world leader, a war leader, and a strategic leader. After Pearl Harbor, so you knew about France potentially becoming a part of England? Do you know?
We talked about it in the Charles de Gaulle episode, yeah.
Okay, now let's see whether you know the other thing that was just about to happen, which is not talked about very much. So after Pearl Harbor, there is a sense that the U-boat menace is a real problem, and that America's support for the UK was predicated on that being successful. In the hope of using Irish ports for counter-submarine operations, Churchill sends a telegram to the Irish Prime Minister, Eamon de Valera, in which he obliquely offers Irish unity. Quote, now is your chance. Now or never, a nation once again. I will meet you wherever you wish. No meeting took place. No record of a response. Hang on a minute. Did you just offer to unify Ireland again? Not talked about very much. There is an element of fear. There is an element of I'm not, and nothing is off the table. But again, incredibly bold.
Yeah.
This is a man who is not predicated by history, not predicated by the way people think it should be done, not swayed by many of the people in his cabinet saying, well, if we come to terms with Hitler, he doesn't really want to invade. This is a man willing to do radical things, which you know how radical they are because we don't talk about them today because they are politically difficult. Very interesting. So it's the beginning of the war. And again, let's be clear, things do not go well. I don't think this is an indictment of Churchill by any means, because I think he was in a difficult place. Here are some of our losses in the 40s, early 40s rather. Norway, Greece, Malaya, Singapore, North Africa, Burma, and not a battle, but the Bengal famine, which I don't know anything about, but I know many people have accused Churchill, and by the way, many people have said this wasn't his fault. They've accused Churchill of, if not causing the Bengal famine, not preventing the Bengal famine. So this was a very, very difficult time, and there is a real sense of persistence. You could have given up, or you could have this is a difficult problem potentially with no solution in end. And I love this.
But I think it's worth picking up on the Bengal famine because it is perhaps the one incident that Churchill gets or comes out very, very poorly in the decision making. And firstly, what a tragedy. Absolutely awful that through deliberate decision making, the food that could have saved so many lives wasn't used to do that. However, we did an episode on dilemmas probably a year ago now. This is a dilemma. There are no good outcomes. And I think one of the difficulties with understanding the famine, and I'm by no means an expert, and I don't claim to be, but I'm aware enough of the wider context of what was happening that there was no right decision that wasn't taken. There was no moment where, through malign action or incompetence or inertia and laziness, a decision was missed where these lives could have been saved. Instead, this was a dilemma when priorities were made, rightly or wrongly, to support the fighting force for the empire and ultimately in the fight against Nazi tyranny, and that was deemed to be a higher priority. And that's a deeply difficult task for anybody to do. And understandably, people now are still unsure. And there's a lot of emotion around it. And I have my view, which is that it was the right call, but it was a difficult call, and it's still going to be a contentious and difficult thing 80 years later.
Doesn't it talk about the fact that as a leader, you I was about to say you're never going to please everyone. That's a terrible statement in terms of a famine, but you will have to make difficult decisions of some kind or other that will make you unpopular.
Yeah.
Let's not use the Bengal famine for this. Let's use the families of all the people killed in the Second World War who might say, but if you'd have given in to the Germans, then my husband, my son would still be alive. There's a sort of there is that challenge as a leader that you need to bear the burden of those choices that you have made and you need to keep on. And I was going to talk about this, which is one of the phrases that I really like that Churchill used. I think I'm going to use this more. Leadership and great leadership is sort of dramatic moments of genius or standing on the battlefield and saying, no, we will go to the left and we will defeat them. These apparent moments of great history. Churchill's favourite phrase, apparently, which he used at the start of each day and at the end of telephone conversations, was keep buggering on.
Yeah.
I love that because that is just a sense of great strategy and great moments are fine, but you have to keep at it. You have to keep buggering on to be able to have those moments of great strategy and great victory. I like that because there's something humble about that in a weird way, which is if you just don't stop, that's the prerequisite for winning.
It's really interesting. I was listening to another podcast with it was an interview with a chap called John White, who's another former Royal Marines officer who was blown up by an IED in Sangin in 2014, I think. But he's a triple amputee and has gone on to do great things, including a lot of international competitive kayaking, sea kayaking mostly. And he talks about mental resilience and leadership. And in this podcast, he talks about a tip that he was taught by his kayak instructor when he was at school, that he now uses to get through difficult times in life, but also when talking to audiences, when he does talks on leadership and resilience. And he says there are 3 rules: keep paddling, keep cool, shit happens, and when shit happens, refer to rule 1. And it's another way of saying keep buggering on. Like, take the small wins, keep going. When you get hit in the face, get up and go again. The small steps that you make in progress over time, they compound and they accumulate. If you stop and concede, that's when you start going backwards. And I think it's brilliant.
Yeah, and I there's something counter-hero about that statement, because the heroes don't do that. The heroes, I've had a great idea. Do you know what I mean? Or I'm going to run up that slope and I'll take them single-handedly. I think this keep buggering on idea, keep paddling, is underestimated, because even if you're not the great strategist, even if you're not the great leader, every single one of us has the ability to keep buggering on. I think it's underestimated, and I think great leaders do that as a matter of course, and then it's all the other things that we remember, but that's still there. So we're 1940, and Churchill is now the leader of the Western world, or Western European world, fighting against Nazi tyranny. What does he do? He turns around and says, I'm going to give you tactical instructions for how we are going to fight the war. And he instructs Hugh Dalton, the Minister of Economic Warfare, to create the Special Operations Executive, which is a group of people. James Bond, think James Bond, albeit in a more World War II scenario, ordered to promote and execute subversive activity in Nazi-occupied Europe, and commandos that were charged with raids on military targets. And this was another one of his famous words, and now go set Europe ablaze. Now, very dramatic, Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, fun film based on really interesting facts. Again, how many leaders do you know that turn around and say, I want you to effectively start a new branch of warfare? There's something, that's the guy who goes to Cuba and fights alongside the Spanish. That's the guy who invents the tank. I think it's quite rare. Interestingly, we talk about startups. He is a serial entrepreneur, Winston Churchill.
Yeah.
Interesting. He would have built 5 companies and sold them one after another and built a bigger company. Would he?
I also think, interestingly, we've talked about him having the humanity and the humility, but this is a side of him where, when the time is right, he will deliberately pick an unfair fight. He will use means that other people will deem ungentlemanly, hence the name of the book. He will endorse dirty underhand tricks. He will endorse extreme violence against the Queen's enemies, or at this time the King's enemies.
Machiavelli is cheering. He's cheering, I tell you.
He is a strategic visionary and a tactical Machiavellian legend. Like, I'm at a point now where I don't know how else to describe Churchill, because he seems to, in the right circumstance, and there are different circumstances throughout, he seems to identify the required style of leadership and then apply it.
And there are too many cases we have talked about on this podcast and the last episode. He has done this too many times for it to be accident or for it to be bullshit. There's time after time, and don't get me wrong, like a great innovator or a great startup entrepreneur, he makes his mistakes and then he moves on. I was wondering, if he was alive today, would he be starting up a rocket company that caught rockets? Would he be Musk?
Oh, well, that's difficult because we have lambasted Musk several times on this
Well,
podcast.
we
And
lambast Musk for how he does it and who he is, but
yeah,
not for the innovation and the
certainly not for the
ignoring.
innovation. I
Oh,
I
I
don't
didn't
want to
know
jump
we
to
were going to have this
conclusions.
discussion. Is he
I'm
a
ner- I'm nervous about the comparison.
Yeah,
Certainly.
that's fine. So it's 1942, and the Beveridge Report is published, which was called the Beveridge Report and Post-War Reforms (brackets Social Insurance and Allied Services). It was a document that talked about the reform of social welfare and effectively became the birth of the welfare state. Interestingly, Churchill is cautious, if not against it, which is counterintuitive given what we have heard of him. Interestingly, though, I think you would almost forgive him for this. He warned the public not to impose great new expenditure on the state without any relation to the circumstances which might prevail at the time.
Yeah.
Put a different way, he said, we have no money. The welfare state is going to cost us an enormous amount of money. Before you promote this too much and declare we will have it, you have to be very, very careful. And so he was very limited in his commitment to the welfare state, which must have been extraordinarily difficult. The Beveridge Report was, in effect, why would you fight? Why would soldiers go away and fight in Germany, the Far East? It is because you are fighting for a better Britain where you have a welfare state, where you are supported, where there is education. So that I find it difficult to judge him harshly on this because I don't think this is purely a, well, you don't deserve it. I think this is a pragmatic leader saying, I cannot promise you something that we don't know we can deliver.
Yeah. I get the impression now that it's likely that this was just
Pragmatism.
yeah, this was nothing more than pragmatism in a difficult situation.
So it's 45. 13th and 15th of February, we bomb Dresden. 1,200 British and US bombers attack a city that is crowded with wounded and refugees from the Eastern Front. And it's part of an area bombing campaign that Churchill himself initiated in January. And it was all about shortening the war. To this day, the bombing of Dresden and indeed the bombing of other German cities is extraordinarily contentious. Many, understandably, describe it as a war crime. Put that to one side. You can argue the efficacy or the right or wrong of bombing Dresden, but interesting is Churchill's response. And on March the 28th, he restricts area bombing and sends a memo to General Ismay, the chief of staff. Quote, the destruction of Dresden remains a serious query against the conduct of Allied bombing. I feel the need for more precise concentration upon military objectives rather than mere acts of terror and wanton destruction, however impressive. I'm sure that people who find great fault in the bombing of Dresden would say, well, he would say that, or that wasn't good enough. But if nothing else, that demonstrates a person who is open enough to reevaluate what he has done, the impact of what he has done. One might argue that the bombing of Germany was about saving British lives at the expense of German lives. In fact, I think that is very clear that is what it was.
Yeah.
You could also argue that while they were bombing civilian targets, and by this time they were specifically dehousing people, which was code for bombing civilian targets, it was about ending the war sooner. However, it's interesting. He could easily say this is justified. And even then, he talks about concentration upon military objectives rather than mere acts of terror and wanton destruction. So, really, really fascinating. even at the end of the war, when he has reason to be bitter and to say they deserved it, there is humanity in the man. And I think that is interesting.
Yeah.
So it's 1945. The war is over. Hitler is dead. What's the next thing that happens? He's voted out of power.
Yeah.
July 1945, there is a general election. It is said that he mishandled the campaign. And get this, this is interestingly, maybe this is a tired leader or a man getting older. In a radio broadcast, he said that a Labour government would require, quote, some form of Gestapo to enforce its agenda. And people said that was one of the things that people remembered, him accusing effectively the Labour Party of being like the Gestapo. I mean, that's not what he's saying, but he was voted out.
Interesting choice of words, isn't it?
And interestingly, Churchill's doctor, Lord Moran, commiserated with him on, quote, the ingratitude of the public. And Churchill replied, I wouldn't call it that. They've had a very hard time. What an interesting response. It would be easy for, not just easy, you might imagine it would be the right thing to say is, those ungrateful bastards, I got them through the war. And his answer was, no, they had a very hard time.
Yeah.
He then went on to, in 1946, to give another one of the famous speeches, which echoes even today. From Stettin to the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All of these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere. So he's now not just talking about the war, he's now addressing, remember we talked in the last episode about how he feared the Soviets, now moving towards that, and he's calling for a special relationship between the British Commonwealth and Empire and the United States. He's keeping buggering on. 1951, made president again. He's made the prime minister again. So he's voted out and brought back in, which just talks about his persistence and how he carries on. So it's 1951. He is 77 now, and he's not in good health. He's had a number of minor strokes. And by 1951, the king's becoming concerned about Churchill's decline. But then the king dies in 1952, and so that's sort of postponed, as it were. In 1953, he is knighted by Queen Elizabeth. And then on the 23rd of June, 1953, he suffers a serious stroke. But the matter is kept secret, and he goes to Chartwell to recuperate. So he is now an old man and who is becoming actually he's struggling. 1955, he retires. So this is sort of his second premiership from 1951 to 55. Clearly his performance is affected now. Remains an MP until he stands down in the 1964 general election. Suffers his final stroke on the 10th of January, 1965, and died on the 24th of January, and given a state funeral. I don't think actually that many people had ever been given a state funeral. I think if I remember rightly, only 2 people had been given a state funeral at that point.
Yeah.
His statue, which I passed 2 weekends ago, is in Parliament Square and was unveiled by his widow Clementine in 1973, and is one of only 12 in the square. And it is rather fetching. If you're in that part of the world, do go look at it. Churchill College, Cambridge, was established as a national memorial to Churchill. And as we talked about in the BBC poll, he attracted nearly 500,000 votes and was voted the greatest Briton of all time. His nearest rival being Gareth, Isambard Kingdom Brunel.
Oh, there we go. Brilliant.
56,000 votes behind. He's one of only 8 people to be granted honorary citizenship of the United States. In 1999, the United States Navy named an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer the USS Winston S. Churchill. There are memorials in North America. There is a National Churchill Museum in Fulton, where he made the Iron Curtain speech, not Iron Cross.
Different.
That's a different speech. There is a Churchill Square in Edmonton. Winston Churchill range of mountains off Lake Louise. What an astounding story, and what an astounding legacy.
Yeah.
One of his biographers said, quote, "I now put Churchill, with all his idiosyncrasies, his indulgences, his occasional childishness, but also his genius, his tenacity, and his persistent ability, right or wrong, successful or unsuccessful, to be larger than life, as the greatest human being ever to occupy number 10 Downing Street." And I thought about this and thought, why would the whole story that we've talked about, why was I so drawn? And unlike many of the other influences we've talked about, where we're very much, well, on one hand, but on the other, he was a hero with clear and repeated bravery. He was a rule breaker, sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly. He was a symbol of hope. We've spent a relatively short amount of time on the Second World War, but he was that symbol of hope that the country followed. A great strategist. We've seen this multiple times, whether it be First World War, Second World War, Cold War. A visionary, creating SOE, the tank.
Yeah.
An incredible orator. We shouldn't underestimate the power of his speeches. He was funny. We haven't talked a lot about the jokes and the sort of the famous quotes, but he was funny. He was a drunk. He drank a lot of alcohol. There's a great story of how when he went to America during Prohibition, his doctor wrote him a prescription for medicinal alcohol so he could drink his champagne in his house. He made a lot of mistakes. We've talked about many of them, but carried on. And I love the fact that he wrote his own history with a 6-volume memoir. Now, I haven't read that, and I kind of want to, because I want to know what kind of a memoir that man writes about himself, because it's going to be about himself. Loved it. Can I give you some quotes before we sort of come together and do the reflection?
Yes, please do.
I love quotes. They're skin deep, don't tell you a lot, but are great. If you're going through hell, keep going. It's a good one. Harsh laws are at times better than no laws at all, Machiavelli's whispering in his ear. Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It's the courage to continue that counts. Next one. Nothing in life is so exhilarating as to be shot at without result. Right? He must have been a laugh in the mess. He must have been a laugh. To improve is to change. So to be perfect is to change often. By the way, you could come up with a whole leadership ethos just with these quotes.
Yeah.
You have enemies. Good. That means you've stood up for something in your life. If you have an important point to make, don't try to be subtle or clever. Use a pile driver. Hit the point once, then come back and hit it again, and then hit it a third time with a tremendous whack.
Okay.
Continuous effort, not strength or intelligence, is the key to unlocking our potential. It's better to be making the news than taking it, to be an actor rather than a critic. Tact there's only a few more, but I love these. I actually deleted a bunch, but these are the ones I just couldn't delete. Tact is the ability to tell someone to go to hell in such a way that they look forward to the trip. An appeaser is one who feels a crocodile, hoping it will eat him last. Write that one down.
Yeah.
The best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. And finally, And most apocryphally, Nancy Astor once said to him, "Sir, if you were my husband, I would poison your tea." And Winston replied, "Madam, if you were my wife, I would drink it." So
Yeah,
come on, Gareth, you've
brilliant.
listened to me trot through over the last couple of hours. What are your final reflections and conclusion on Winston Churchill?
I think as we've gone through these last two episodes, I've said quite clearly as we've gone along that I've become more and more drawn in to becoming a Churchill fan, and I think I was a Churchill fan before we started. Let's be
We
very
kind of
clear about that.
why did we? I think that's how I felt. It's like I know you should like Churchill, and
I I think I try and be objective in our discussions, and of course I never am, but I try to be, and I try to look at the different perspectives that other people might have, and the the context within which these stories arose, how much of it is apocryphal, how much of it is legacy that perhaps the individual wrote themselves. But I can't help but think I leave these two episodes in great admiration of a chap who really grasped life by the horns from the very beginning, but not only that, throughout continued to think about the impact that he could make, but without think about the impact that he could make without it being, or I don't know actually, was it about his legacy? But it seems to me that he was a guy who learned through experience, developed strong convictions, was wise enough to see what those convictions would mean in the long term, and then, as you've just said in the quote, would hammer his points. He he was a tactical. I'm not sure I'd say tactical genius, but he was a tactician. He saw pragmatically how to get things done, and at the same time, he was a visionary leader. He could write. He could give great speeches that brought people along, even when the views were contentious. He had the foresight to understand the implications of the decisions that he and others around him were making, or what would happen if those decisions weren't made. He was a serial entrepreneur, generating new ideas, new ways of doing things. And I think most importantly of all of this, he was a man who had the courage of his convictions, whether those were in um, in vogue with the population or not, and would stand up for what he fundamentally believed to be right. And I think ultimately, of all the things that Churchill is famous for, perhaps that one is the one that I'm most impressed by.
I'm also struck by the fact that many of our leaders, you could perhaps imagine that you could describe how you could be a leader like them. I can't even tell you why. I couldn't imagine how to recreate being Churchill. There's something, there's sort of a pixie dust about this, which is 10 people could do everything that Churchill did and be terrible failures. But there's something that Churchill did that made him successful, even though there were lots of reasons he should be. Do you know what I
Yeah,
mean? I
I do.
can't, I don't, I don't think we can say we have deconstructed Churchill. If we behave this way, we will all be great like Winston Churchill. There really was something magical about him, that he pulled off things that he shouldn't have been able to pull off. He should have been dead and buried politically after the Dardanelles campaign.
Yeah,
He shouldn't have escaped. He shouldn't have been. You could actually, maybe you could look at his career and say, here were 30 times when his career should have been over, or he should have stopped, and he didn't. And
yeah.
that is, I think, quite remarkable.
No, I
They,
agree with you completely. I think other leaders we've looked at in the past and other individuals, yeah, there's always that element of character that is intangible. but normally there's a sort of some
Pattern.
trends, some ideas. With Churchill, I think it feels a bit like a Jenga tower that you can't separate out the uncomfortable, awkward bits from the genius. It is just one package, and any one bit that's removed, it just wouldn't have worked.
Fate rolled her dice and came up with Churchill.
Amazing. Well, thanks, Chris, because that genuinely, for 2 and a bit hours of discussion, has been hugely informative and really interesting. And a person that I knew a fair amount about, you've added a huge amount of meat onto the bones there. So thank you for doing the work.
Pleasure. That was a cracker, that was. And it's always nice to learn a bit more and go, I didn't know that. So glad you enjoyed it, and hope everyone else enjoyed it as well.
If you did, do us a favour and pass it on to one person that you think would benefit and get them to subscribe to the podcast as well. As always, please comment, come back to us, throw spears at what we said, ask questions. We're at Battling with Biz on X, or you can email us at battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com. Please rate, review if you've got the time, like and subscribe. Go back and listen to previous episodes, and please do push this out on your social feeds or tell your friends if you think that they too would get benefit from listening to this podcast. But for now, just say thank you very much for joining us, and we will see you again next week.
See you again next week on Battling with Business.
Cheerio.